Hi, and welcome to another episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for pressing play. This episode, we have returning guest, author, and D&D historian Mike Witwer. He's here to talk about his newest book, The Legend of Drizzt Visual Dictionary. It's one of those DK visual dictionaries that's really super cool, and it's not only chock full of goodness on everyone's favorite drow, but the Forgotten Realms in general. As Mike puts it during the show, the Drizzt books are the greatest tour of the Forgotten Realms that the setting has ever gotten. We also talk about Drizzt, get into some trivia, including how many Drizzt books there's been and how many millions of copies they've sold and cool stuff like that. We also get into Mike has several other projects going right now, including a sequel to Art Arcana. I don't know if you remember that, but it was an amazing D&D history book of the art of D&D. But this new sequel is focusing on 5e. He's also got a young adult novel featuring a historic game in a town that might seem familiar to D&D fans. That'll be coming out soon. So we also have some D&D movie discussion. We get into the importance of documenting D&D and RPG history. I pose tough questions to Mike, like what magic items would he choose from the Drizzt books? And what books would Mike recommend to introduce someone to Drizzt? So, and other fun, cool, geeky stuff while we're at it. Don't forget last episode 267, which is with Chris Holmes, who is the son of John Eric Holmes. We get into the first basic D&D set from 1977 that his father wrote, and Edgar Rice Burroughs fiction and all kinds of cool stuff. So make sure to check that out. Anyway, with no further ado, on with the show.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes. I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky all up in your podcasts. It's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for pressing play. Returning to the show. It's been too long. Great guest, always fun. Michael Witwer, aka Mike Witwer. How do you want to officially go on the podcast tonight there, Mike? Michael? Mike? What do you want to be?
Thanks, Shane. I am very happy to go with Mike or Michael. I'm happy with I'm really, really happy with either way. I'm just happy to be here. Just happy to be here.
Mike is a writer, and he often focuses on D&D history and related topics. Some of the things that we've talked with Mike about before include Empire of the Imagination. He also worked on the amazing Art Arcana book that came out. Oh, how many? Has that been about 3 or 4 years now?
Yeah, 2018. It's hard for me to believe myself. It was 2018, October. Yeah.
So Art Arcana, which is an amazing walk through the history of D&D through its art. Absolutely amazing. You worked on that with John Peterson, Kyle Newman, and your brother Sam, right?
Absolutely right. We pulled together that team, and that project. You know, for what it's worth, that project to me, I'm not sure if I'll ever work on a better project in the respect that the ground we covered from a scholarship standpoint, kind of the new ground we covered. Again, I'm not sure if I'll ever work on another project like that, and that was largely thanks to people like John Peterson and many collectors and artists and all these people we got to talk to, and just. It was like an archaeology project. Mm-hmm. It was just such an unbelievably exciting project.
That is super. Yeah, no, I've got much respect for the Art Arcana book and the other stuff you work on. You've actually got so. I want to make sure to mention at this point that one of the main topics we're going to be talking about today with Mike is he's got a new book out. The Legend of Drizzt Visual Dictionary, one of those DK books, those amazing DK books that I love looking through that are just jam-packed with cool artwork and trivia and notes and whatnot. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Drizzt Do'Urden. We're going to, Drizzt, it's the more you research Drizzt, and it's mind-boggling how popular Drizzt is and we'll be talking about how many novels he's been in and how many copies they've sold, and it's just ridiculous. So we're going to be talking about that. And so we'll dig into not only that book, but talking about Drizzt and by extension, by default, the Forgotten Realms, which is just for a setting for an RPG game. The realms over the years has become incredibly detailed, and it has its own history, and it has all this really cool stuff. So we're going to be talking about that. That'll be the focus for the majority of the discussion here in a little bit. But, Mike is a working author and has a lot of other cool projects going on too. So, we've talked about his book from a few years ago, Empire of the Imagination. We talked about Art and Arcana, a visual history of Dungeons and Dragons. I believe that's the name of it. Amazing book. Anybody who's into D&D and or fantasy art, you really, in my opinion, should own it. But if not, at least go down to the library and get it and spend some time. You'll be blown away. Absolutely fantastic book. You've also done, what was it the Adventurer's Feast? What's the cookbook that you and the crew did?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, so in 2020, we did the first official D&D cookbook, which was called Heroes Feast. Heroes Feast, of course,
Feast, yeah.
named after the spell.
Right.
Yeah, and so that one was, again, same publisher as Art and Arcana. In fact, it was that same publisher's idea. And I'll tell you, the way it came about, frankly, was that we were having such a good time doing Art and Arcana together. It was already looking really good. I believe we started that project even before we finished Art and Arcana. But we had a really good experience with the publisher at Penguin Random House 10 Speed. And it just so happened that the publisher over there, really passionate D&D player himself, a fellow named Aaron Wayner, and he happens to also be a big deal cookbook publisher. In fact, so he runs Clarkson Potter as well. That's one of his imprints, which is the imprint that does Barefoot Contessa. So like he's a big deal cookbook publisher, and he had this idea for a while. He really wanted to do this for a long time. So he actually brought the idea to us. And really thought this could really benefit from a deep dive on D&D lore and all the things that it could be, right? It was a very high level sketch going out at the outset, and we put our heads together and figured out what can we do that can be a really compelling, essential D&D cookbook, and we really drilled deep down. And in fact, the way we approached it is that, this is going to be the D&D food source book, whether it's got D&D statistics and so forth, whatever. This is going to have more about D&D food than anything else has ever had before. And I mean lore. I mean, we dug into the lore.
So even if for some reason, like if you buy it, it's a cookbook, but if you buy it and you're like, I don't want to cook any of these recipes, you can use them for your game, right? The lore of the...
Oh, 100%. Yeah, right. Well, so because it's organized by, different cultures. There's elven food, there's halfling food, there's dwarven food, and so forth. And we do a real deep dive on, what do elves typically eat? What do wood elves typically eat? What do they source? How do they source it? What's typical etiquette? Like we did all that research, and we wrote up. I think in fact we even as a matter of fact we even structured those pieces based on how the player's handbook actually talks about different categories even in the character building section. So we really dove deep on that one. We found every notable food that we could. That was in D&D lore, which believe it or not, wasn't it wasn't a super rich history. I mean, there's plenty, don't get me wrong, there's 40 years of stuff there, and you can go to a lot of early modules and find drink lists and food lists and so forth. And of course there's really famous stuff like Odyx spiced potatoes, right, from the Dragonlance series.
That's probably
there's stuff that comes up
famous.
More than others.
Right. Yeah.
I think it is. I think in terms of what gets some real narrative real estate, I think it's probably that. Of course, we have that in the book naturally, but yeah, it was funny. There wasn't as much as one might expect, considering that for example, you've got Volo's guides. There was it's a dozen Volo's guides that have nothing but ratings on taverns and stuff. So as you can expect, we got a lot of material from those because Volo does talk about this tavern in Tribor has this type of this type of fare. So we of course got a lot of material from that. But again, you'd be surprised how little detail in a lot of cases there was on food. So we dug deep on that one, and we're really proud with how that came together. And by the way, I can't, really, if you want to know where the real stars of the show were, 10 Speed makes incredibly beautiful cookbooks. We got an incredible photographer in Ray Cacciatorian who does this all the time. Incredible stylists, like Hollywood level stylists and prop people. And then you pair that with, they got a world-class chef from America's Test Kitchen, a fellow named Adam Reed. And so all that coming together made for a really, really fun cookbook that's done pretty darn well. So we're really, really proud of it.
That is cool. So here's a story that you might like. And again, but I want to make sure that was you. And again, the team, the quartet, you, John Peterson, Kyle, I just said his name and now it's escaped me. I want to say Newberry. And
Kyle Newman. So that was Kyle Newman, John Peterson, and myself. My brother actually dropped off that one. He was actually booked pretty heavily at that period of time. So he actually didn't work on that one, but he rejoined us again for our most recent sequel to Art Arcana, our most recent visual history.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on that one here in a second. But I want to tell you a nice story that you'll enjoy. So last year at North Texas RPG Con, which is a con I try to go to every year. I've actually seen John Peterson there before. He makes it every now and then. It's sort of the Gen Con of the South. But last year, the hotel for the convention made a bunch of like snacks and drinks and stuff from the Heroes Feast. And they had them out for all the attendees as you were checking in to the hotel. So they actually had a little picture of the book in a frame, and around it they had halfling oatmeal sweet nibbles, and they had goodberry blend punch, and let's see what else they had here. I think that was the two main things they had. But they had the cookies and the punch out, and they had a picture of the Heroes Feast cover, and then they had the recipes setting out so people could see where the recipe came from. So I thought that was pretty neat. I thought you might get a kick out of that.
That's awesome. Honestly, and that not only makes me feel good, but I love that they did that for no other reason than the intent of that book was really about, how do we meld, if you think about any tabletop activity, right? Eating is a place that you're sharing a meal and you're sharing a conversation. Eating a meal and playing a role-playing game are not, a tabletop game anyway, not that different, right? Like, these are very shared activities, and we really went to a lot of trouble to make sure that, to kind of basically give you an opportunity to eat the way your character might eat, right? So we made sure to make dishes that were, appropriate to the D&D world and actually came from D&D books. And so I'm really glad they did that, because again, I think it's a really unique and new way one can kind of get into the mindset, you might say, of playing a good tabletop game than eating something that your character might eat at the Yawning Portal. I think we were really excited about that notion.
All right, so then you've also got, before we get to talking about Drizzt and your new book, your visual dictionary of Drizzt, The Legend of Drizzt, you've also got a new book, and it sounds like your brother's back involved on the quartet of you, Kyle Newman, John Peterson, and your brother Sam Witwer. And you have a book on the art of 5e, which is, let's see, it's called Lore and Legends, which is a clever play on Legends and Lore, a visual celebration of the 5th edition of the world's greatest role-playing game. So, 5th edition's been around since like 2015, something like that. So,
2014, 2014 is
2014.
Right.
So not quite the history of the entire Art and Arcana, but there's still quite a lot there to dig into. And I've seen some really nice art for 5th edition. So tell us a little bit about that. What can we expect from Lore and Legends? And is it literally out yet, or is it impending?
No, thanks for the question, Shane. So basically think of it as a sequel to Art and Arcana. It uses the exact same methodology. It's the same publisher. It's the same form factor. It's basically about the same size. It's a big coffee table type book, just like Art and Arcana, same length. In fact, believe it or not, has more images, which I couldn't believe. It actually, but again, I mean, they both are chock full of images, right? So the deal with Lore and Legends is that when we finished Art and Arcana, consider that that book came out at the end of 2018. The book effectively fizzles out kind of early 2018, right? We had to finish the book, right? You have to close content, as they say, at some point. So it fizzles out kind of in the beginning of 2018. And that's, of course, kind of like, right, still, let me put it this way. 5e was already a big deal by then. 5th edition was already a big deal by then. So it wasn't like it was novel at that point to say like, wow, this thing's really blown up. It's been great. But again, it was tip of the iceberg based on what we know now, right? It's 5 years later. So here was the thing we really wanted to capture with 5th edition. After we finished Art and Arcana, and actually I would say after we finished probably Heroes Feast, actually, we had talked as an author team a little bit about, believe it or not, we had even thought about covering the story of 5th edition in like a traditional nonfiction book. Think like Empire of Imagination or John Peterson's Playing at the World. We thought about like teaming up and actually writing like a traditional, like no pictures, just words, nonfiction book, because we thought the story of what had happened with 5th edition was such an extraordinary one. That is, remember D&D circa 2012 was at one of its absolute lowest points. It's at the end of 4th edition. 4th edition had not gone well. It had one of its lowest playerships that it had probably, since like 1st edition. And again, trouble was afoot, and the thing that we were really amazed about in terms of kind of just a pop culture story was how did this analog game that again, totally got overshadowed by computer role-playing games, by MMOs, like World of Warcraft, for example. How did this game that was 40 years old and that was on its kind of deathbed, how did this thing not only get resurrected, using a D&D term, but like become like a superstar in today's era in just a couple short years? And so this 10-year turnaround, what we thought was just an incredible story by anyone, like pictures aside, we thought this was just an amazing story that demanded an explanation. Like, how did this actually happen? Because this game was on life support in 2012, and all of a sudden in 2022 we're talking about blockbuster film franchises. We're talking about year-over-year growth that WotC and D&D had never seen before. Like, what happened here? And of course, as you can expect, Shane, and again, I think most of your listeners will probably know this, there's of course a number of factors that we wanted to explore. Things like, obviously, the advent of actual play, on Twitch, Critical Role, The Adventure Zone, Stranger Things, bringing D&D to the pop culture. There was probably 5 or 6 main factors that played a huge role. And one of the biggest of which, of course, was that they made an awesome system, right? They did a bunch of play testing, with D&D Next. They got almost 200,000 people to participate in this huge game test. And then they put together this great rule set for 5th edition, paired with a lot of great art. And so what we realized is that this incredible story could actually also be, like with Art and Arcana, which we did just done, it could be just as easily told with pictures, and really great pictures. So it is an art book. It's an art book of 5th edition, but it's not exclusively art. Just like Art and Arcana focuses on things like, it's got everything from, of course, advertising and pictures to ephemera, to ads, to pamphlets about the Satanic Panic and all this other stuff. We did the exact same treatment here over the last 10 years, a really deep dive on what happened over the last 10 years. So it is, of course, a celebration of 5th edition. It's an art book of 5th edition, but it's also got a lot of other great things that tell this, what we think is a really compelling story about how this game turned around and what it's done over the last 10 years. So super excited about Lore and Legends coming out in October. Yeah, for anyone that enjoyed Art and Arcana, I promise you'll see a lot of the same. Again, I'm going to say it's the same methodology, and in fact, it's just a sequel. It's an extension. If you could imagine, if you stopped Art and Arcana at Chapter 8, and then you just picked up this book from there, it's like you get a super detailed version of the last 10 years is kind of what you're getting. So we think it all went together really nicely. It's a gorgeous book. And of course, I can't say enough about the art and the artists that have done incredible things with 5th edition. And of course, Shane, as you well know, and I know you play 5e, of course, 5th edition has done so many throwbacks to previous D&D IP, whether it's Acererak or Strahd and all these other great campaigns and villains and IP. So there's all of these opportunities to do a lot of throwback and informational stuff on that, right? We had just done so much work on that. Like when we talk about Xanathar's guide, we give you like a who is Xanathar? What's the history of Xanathar? When did he first show up? And of course we get real deep on that stuff. A Serac, we can go back to 1975, with the original Tomb of Horrors campaign and give you a little kind of deep dive on what that's about. So we, of course, use all of that history we have to influence how we're contextualizing the current history. So
that's cool. Yeah, and there's one little tidbit that I probably knew, but I either learned it or relearned it from your Drizzt book, is there have been many Xanathars. There are a series of beholders named Xanathar that run the Xanathar. I never knew that.
Yes.
Yeah. Or I don't remember knowing that.
So Xanathar is more of a title than it is a name. Yeah. It is a title of the head of the Xanathar's Guild in Skullport there below Waterdeep. So that's a thing.
Well, I love that the current Xanathar is kind of insane about this goldfish that keeps dying. And his flunkies have to keep replacing the goldfish so that Xanathar won't get upset that his goldfish died. So I love little stuff. Yeah,
I got to find out who. I love it too, and I got to find out who came up with that. It actually sounds like a Chris Perkins.
That does sound
book. Chris, of course, he's one of the heads of. It really does. I love it though. The notion that you have this tyrannical beholder running the Xanathar's Guild. He's notorious. He's ruthless. Everyone's terrified of him, but he's got this soft spot for this goldfish that he looks at so lovingly with his primary eye, and that it keeps dying because goldfish die all the time, right? So he keeps dying, and all of his followers are scrambling constantly to make Xanathar think the goldfish is still alive by replacing it. I think that is such a brilliant hook. Right. I love it.
Well, it's a perfect example of role-playing in the sense that you take a monster beyond its stat block, right? And you give it a personality and you make it like part of a real kind of world. And that's a perfect example of doing something like that. Speaking of monsters becoming sort of real and giving them little quirks, I know you mentioned before we started recording that you've seen the new D&D movie. And I finally got to go see it just recently. I almost didn't get to catch it in the theater, but I had to, because my players, we did Out of the Abyss and Thimberchod. Is it Thimberchod, the red dragon, is in Out of the Abyss.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He's also in the movie. And I had to tell my players that Thimberchod may have had a couple of snacks since the last time they saw him. Dude, that was a fat dragon.
Well, it was really interesting, for them to use something in Out of the Abyss, which is, of course, is 2015 module, right, for 5th edition. Again, big picture on the movie. I adored the movie. I really loved it. I thought it was just a thrill ride.
It's a lot of fun.
It felt like a game of D&D to me.
It was
just a lot of fun. And what I would say about it is that, again, they were in lockstep with what's going on with the tabletop division over there at Wizards. They were in lockstep. In fact, I happen to know that John Francis Daly, one of the directors and writers, he I don't know if you knew this, but he consulted on their 2020 Icewind Dale module. Rime of the Frost Maiden. He's listed as one of the contributors on there. He was working with Chris, and again, they worked together. We come to find out later the reason they worked together is that they wanted to establish what they call Revel's End. Revel's End is the prison that the main characters start in the movie. That's Revel's End. It's in that module from 2020. And I thought the fact that they were so interested in making sure that this was an established real place on the tabletop role-playing game before they put it in the movie tells you so much about how much they cared about being legit to the IP. I was like, this is really
they went out of their way it was straight up in the Forgotten Realms. I mean, it was deeply, deeply in the Forgotten Realms.
The directors and writers of that movie, and the actors for that matter, I loved everybody in that film. They did their homework. They did their homework, and that bodes really well for, if whether you're a longtime D&D fan or whether you were completely new to it or don't know anything about D&D. I thought there was something brilliant about the fact that I don't think they made anything in that movie really hinge on you have to know all of this about D&D to enjoy this. There, of course, was inside jokes. There were Easter eggs. There were all kinds of stuff like that. But I didn't think anything really hinged on it in a way that would make the movie not enjoyable to your average moviegoer who might just love fantasy film and doesn't know anything about D&D. Again, there's a lot I would say about it. We could do a whole episode, I'm sure, about talking about the strengths of the movie. I really enjoyed the movie. I just loved it. I wish it was longer.
Yeah. Well, that's basically what I've told everybody. I said it was a lot of fun. It was firmly in the Forgotten Realms. I mean, in fact, when they go recruit the paladin from Monbrun Shield was the name of the village that the paladin was in. My characters in my players in the game I run are in Monbrun Shield right now. Right. So,
wow.
Yeah. So my ears really perked up, when they said, yeah, we're in Monbrun Shield. But yeah, they went to Nesme, they went to Waterdeep. They were all over the place. And they were, they worked in the Harpers. They worked in the Emerald Enclave.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very, and then they worked in, there was an Aarakocra, there was a Dragonborn, there was Tabaxi. They worked it all in. Of course.
They were trying to cover the bases. I mean, they were, but again, there was, so it's funny. We're obviously talking a bit about the Drizzt books today, the legend, and of course my recent Legend of Drizzt visual dictionary. So actually, one thing that I thought was super cool. Now, obviously, the Forgotten Realms, to put it right out there, right? Drizzt is probably the most famous character of the Forgotten Realms, right? There's 40 books.
The next most popular would probably be Elminster, but Drizzt by far is the most well known.
And one thing I thought was super cool. So while Drizzt is not in the movie, and maybe we'll get lucky and we'll get a movie about Drizzt, down the road somewhere. But I thought it was super cool that they used. Now I don't want give any spoilers here for anyone that hasn't seen the movie yet, but let me just say, so anyone that's a fan of Drizzt out there knows the series, specifically the Neverwinter trilogy. If you know what that trilogy is about and the notion of a Thayan dread ring, that's the basis for what's going on in Neverwinter in the movie. If you understand what a dread ring is and what's going on in the arena there in the movie and all that, like they use that whole concept. And I'm like, this is really cool. And again, it was kind of like, it was a nice, more than an Easter egg. It was really kind of giving a nod. And not that only shows up in Drizzt stuff, but that's where it's probably most prominently shows up. Zastam and how he does the Dread Ring and how they set him up. So again, like if you know the Drizzt books, especially the Neverwinter trilogy, you see all of that stuff going on in Neverwinter, especially near the end. And you're like, oh, I know exactly where they got these ideas and how they've adapted them here. This is really cool.
Yeah.
So
no, they had a lot of fun with it. I also liked, so I agree with you. You don't have to know D&D or the Forgotten Realms to enjoy the movie. It's just people understand fantasy, right? They understand, sort of high fantasy and this and that, just from decades of cinema and all this different stuff. So there's nothing in here that the average person couldn't go to and just sit back and enjoy. But they did work in a lot of in-jokes, Easter eggs, loving nods. Here's what I liked. In addition to the things you've mentioned, they worked in sort of table banter. And what I mean by that is like when they keep coming up with plans, you're like, this is a stupid plan. And this is exactly what my table would do. This is a really dumb plan. And they even acknowledge, you're like, no, that's a terrible plan. Okay, so we're going to go to plan B. Now we're going back to plan C, which is plan A. Well, why are you calling it plan C? Well, because plan A has a stink on it, and it's just, and I love when they're, when they're, these ridiculous plans. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to dig through the stone and you turn into a worm and, just all the crazy, plans that players come up with. But I loved when there's a scene where they're using a magic item in a graveyard. And that's all I'll say. Other than the fact where like, you can use this magic item and then you can ask 4 questions, I think it was. And they were like, why only 4 questions? It's like, I don't know. That's just how it works. And that's the exact kind of discussion you get. I don't know. That's what the book says, And then I told my players after I saw the movie, I said, you are not getting a hither-thither staff. You are absolutely not getting a hither-thither staff. So
yeah, that's a pretty high-powered item. That came in a lot of handy to that group, didn't it?
Well, you'll notice, and I may be reading too much into this, but when the party in the movie started overly relying on the hither-thither staff, it's like the DM stepped in and suddenly like, nope, things have gone sideways and it's not working the way you want it to work.
Well, honestly, that's what the movie to me felt like a great game of D&D. And, I mean, to your point, you talked about plans earlier. To me, I think what felt most like D&D, at least my experience with it, after years of playing, is that plans always break down. That's one of the brilliant parts of the game, is that you make a plan, inevitably you've got someone at the table who's like wasn't listening, right? Like it's what always happens. And plans always break down because that's just what happens in D&D, and then all the hijinks and fun that comes out of that.
Right.
And so to me, that movie was nothing but that. As you say, it was plans breaking down. And even again, I don't want to give anything away, but so the opening part where he's testifying to try to get on bail, and the thing with Jonathan, like the notion that he's making that big case,
right,
and that he still has this plan. And even after they do all of that, like, have you ever been in a game where like you come up with this plan and something in the game changes dramatically where the plan doesn't really apply anymore, but you and your whole team still stick to the plan just because you're like not, like that's totally what happens there. And you're like, this is so, it just felt so D&D to me. Everything about how that movie kind of worked just felt so like a game of D&D to me. And that's what I think I liked about it the most.
Yeah, the Jonathan thing was great. It's like, where's Minister Jonathan? Yeah, that was great.
I cannot say enough about the performances too. Like I just thought everybody just nailed it. Just was great.
Another thing they did kind of with a wink is at the beginning when he's trying to make his case, what he's doing is he's giving his character's backstory. And the ministers are like, okay, whatever, just get to the point, because people will wear you out with their backstory. That was, I felt like that was another wink at an age-old D&D trope of these overly evolved backstories. So,
oh, totally. No. I think it's all of that, right? And so yeah, I just thought it was really well executed. It was just these people. I said something about this lately in another interview, which was that. Not to get into the 2000 movie, and we could do a whole episode on the original Dungeons and Dragons 2000 film that, with Jeremy Irons and so forth, that didn't do so great. Here's the thing. The people that made that movie, the person that actually got that movie made, Courtney Solomon, loves D&D. As far as I know, I don't know the guy, but evidently he's just a huge D&D fan, loves it. He didn't have a lot of filmmaking experience, and again, topic for another day, But importantly, he may have loved D&D, but his movie didn't love D&D. Yeah. That movie decidedly doesn't love D&D. Whereas this movie, the one that just came out, Honor Among Thieves, this movie loves D&D. And you can tell the people that made it, you can tell the people that are in it, and you can tell everything about the movie itself, the very essence of the film. It loves D&D. And that is what I think I liked about it most. Whatever that means to you, but that's how I felt about it.
It was, I mean, there was a lot of love for D&D. I would say this is a 2000 movie tried to love D&D, but it didn't come through. Like somebody somewhere involved with that, like the director, Courtney, or whoever, loved D&D, but it didn't have the synergy, whatever, the sum of its parts was not there, and I've often heard it joked that Jeremy Irons was probably like, how did I end up on this set? Like what has happened here? So,
well, and his performance in that film is so over the top.
Yeah, it really is.
It's
camp.
Again,
it's camp.
That one deserves its own. That one deserves its own episode for sure. Making movies, making any performance, any art form, super hard, right? And that's one thing I've really learned over the years too, is that I've been very humbled, and I really try to see the good in anything. Again, it's just so hard to make anything good, and I really appreciate. I watched that movie. I say, gosh, I see the effort here. I see what they were trying to do, and it's just too bad they couldn't make it gel, unfortunately. But
All right, moving on. So you've got the Lore and Legends Visual Celebration of the 5th edition of the world's greatest role-playing game dropping in October. And then you have a non-D&D book, but I want to make sure to give you a chance to talk about this before we talk about Drizzt. Vivian Van Tassel and the Secret of Midnight Lake, which is coming out in August. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So thanks, Shane. Yeah. So this one, I have to tell you, I haven't. I'm jumping out of my skin. I'm so excited about this book. I will tell you, just because it was a passion book. I guess all my books are passion books, if I'm going to be honest. But this was different because again, this is my first published novel. It's a middle grade young adult fantasy novel that. So actually, let me tie it together to something that we started with. We started with talking about Empire of Imagination. So believe it or not, this is very tied to Empire of Imagination. So any of the listeners out there that know that book, that was my first book from 2015, and that was a biography about Gary Gygax and the birth of Dungeons and Dragons. It was written in a narrative nonfiction style, or what they call creative nonfiction. So I wrote the book to feel and read like a novel, even though it was a nonfiction book, right? Tons of research behind things. I'll, of course, cut away and talk about all the fine details and so forth. But I have scenes in that book, right? I write scenes as if they're happening in a novel situation, scenes that really happened. And so when I was working on that book it got published in 2015. I worked on that for 3 years. Somewhere in that process, maybe around 2014, it may have been early in 2015. I'll never forget the day, actually, because I remember I was sitting on the train on my way down to the office, and this idea struck me like a lightning bolt. At the time, I was studying. I was digging deep on one of the facts about Gary Gygax's childhood, which is that as a kid in his town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, there was once an abandoned sanitarium on the hill. It was called Oakwood Sanitarium, real place, and it was on a hill that kind of overlooks Lake Geneva. It's literally like the highest point in town. The rest of the town, you kind of descend into a little bit of kind of a valley, and then you've got this huge beautiful lake. Now, Lake Geneva, of course, that's ground zero. That's where D&D was born. That's where TSR was for all those years, right? So Lake Geneva is a really interesting town. It's got a fascinating history in and of itself. It was kind of this really wealthy kind of country retreat for a lot of really wealthy Chicago and Milwaukee families that would build these huge mansions around the lake. That is to say, like the Schwinn Mansion and the Wrigley Mansion, like names that like from major brands, owned these mansions all around the lake. So it's just a fascinating town. It's this kind of this southern Wisconsin town that's a great fishing lake, and it's got all these mansions. So this is where D&D was born. And I was studying at the time this Oakwood Sanitarium because as the story goes, what Gary used to talk about is that when he was a kid, he used to go into the abandoned ruins of Oakwood Sanitarium, which was this ominous Romanesque building on the hill that was in fact abandoned when he was a kid. And by the way, I have pictures of what this place looked like when Gary was a kid, and you almost can't believe it was real. So this notion that there was this sanitarium that was founded in 1885, it was on the top of this hill, is this really kind of ornate 4 or 5 story building with a bell tower and really, wild looking place. And it operated till about 1925, and then it closed, and then it shuttered, and it was literally lay abandoned throughout Gary's childhood until it was eventually raised, I think, sometime in the 50s. So again, what Gary talks about is one of his big inspirations for D&D was that when he was a kid, he used to go and this was kind of a rite of passage for young, troublemaking Lake Geneva youths, is they would go and they would wander around the creepy abandoned sanitarium in town, right? And so I dug into the history of this a little bit, and one of the facts that I found about Lake Geneva, and again the history of D&D and so forth, was this town, Lake Geneva, had a bunch of sanitariums in the old days. There was like a half dozen in town. Now, in truth, a lot of these were not like the institutional variety that a lot of people think of when they think about, horror novels and things like that. But, it had a bunch of these sanitariums. And I thought it was such an interesting backdrop to not only the childhood of Gary Gygax, but it was just such an interesting fact about this town that, again, like D&D was born there and all that. So I remember one morning sitting on the train, I was studying this at the time, and I was just struck as like a lightning bolt. And I came up with this idea. I was given this idea of how interesting this would be of this backdrop of this town where it was kind of this what if. Well, what if the town had so many sanitariums in the old days because people that were committed into them were having delusions about seeing fantasy monsters in the woods. For example, bears with the face of owls and floating spheres with 10 eyes, right? So I thought, oh, that was and then what if somebody ended up making a game based on these supposed delusions, but again, they weren't actually delusions, right? The reason there were so many sanitariums in town is because people were really seeing these things, right? And so that was this what if that started me on this path. And so cut ahead to now, I've finally written this book that I wanted to write about. That was heavily inspired by, of course, my study of Gary Gygax and of D&D's history. But of course, it's Vivian Van Tassel and the Secret of Midnight Lake. And it's about this girl that moves to this new town, and she goes to this new school, and her school is actually in a converted sanitarium. And it's in town there, and the game Beasts and Battlements was created in town, and so again, it has a lot of inspiration, you might say, about tabletop role playing games, about D&D, and so forth, and again, that's where this whole thing started, and again, I was just really passionate about it, and so what we have today is kind of this. You might say this is kind of Percy Jackson meets Fablehaven meets D&D. And that's kind of what this book is. And again, it was a passion project, and I'm super happy to just have it out of my head and onto paper. And it's coming out at the end of August. So I'm just going to say it. I think anybody that actually loves D&D or D&D history or wants to remember what it's like riding bikes around town as a kid, playing D&D and all that stuff, it's all there, right? It's all that stuff. It's written for like 10 to 12-year-olds, but it's also written for, you might say, anybody that's played D&D for a long time, I actually think would quite enjoy it. So again, if you or your kids are interested in D&D or you want to learn more about it, again, super, again, passion project for me, and I'm really proud of it. So I hopefully, it'll do okay.
I think that's great. So it says, I don't know if you've probably seen the Amazon page, but if you haven't, it says a debut epic middle grade fantasy from the New York Times best-selling Dungeons and Dragons expert, Michael Witwer. Did you know you're now an official Dungeons and Dragons expert?
Well, no, I guess I did. It's funny. There's so much to know. I'm not sure I'll ever actually feel like an expert. I guess I feel like, like anything else, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, right? And that certainly is the case with D&D and anything else I've ever done. I will say that, there's some parts of D&D history and lore at this point that I feel pretty strong, like I'm decent in at this point. But yeah, can you ever really learn the totality of this thing? You've had so many creative minds churning out so much material over now 50 years. It's just impossible to know it all. So, I try to know what I know, but that's about all I can do.
Well, between you and John Peterson, and Kyle Newman and your brother and the Art Arcana book, but your Empire of the Imagination and, John's like Playing at the World and Game Wizards and he's got another book. I had it on my desk not that long ago. The elusive shift. Elusive shift. Yeah, exactly. I feel like between reading those books, talking to you guys directly, talking to other people about it, I've got a pretty firm grasp on the early days of D&D. Whereas before I started reading, you guys' books, talking to other people, really digging into it, I was like, oh, well, there was Chainmail, and then there was D&D, and that was the whole story. And it's so much different than that. There's so much more to it, so many different influences. Gary Gygax is a very important figure in the history of D&D, but, Dave Arneson and the Blackbourne Bunch, very important. I look at it like people are like, well, is Gary Gygax? No, it's Dave Arneson. To me, it's chocolate and peanut butter. You can't take them apart, to get to where we got.
Oh gosh, yes, 100%. It took a village like anything, and there was a lot of other people on that list too that I think were hugely formative to the game.
I think is it David Wesley with Braunstein, and so much.
Yeah,
but that's just the early days. There's so much in the past 50 years of of different role-playing games in D&D and different contributors and people who came up with the mechanics and people who played it and championed it. That's what I was saying when as important as D&D and role-playing games are to pop culture now, when you compared doing Art and Arcana to archaeology, that's why I was like, it's exactly what it is. I mean, there are scholars, 200 years from now that are going to be looking at all of this because of the impact it's had on, I mean, you can't even count the amount of creative people now who are giving D&D and role-playing games credit for, how they learned to be creative or how they got into this stuff or whatever. I mean, from TV shows to movies to get video games are just lousy with mechanics from D&D. Right. And look how much time people are spending playing video games. And like I said, that's a whole topic for a podcast in and of itself. But the history of this stuff's really important.
Well, and and Shane, when we started it, or earlier on, I did talk about, I talked about, I'm not sure I'll ever work on as an important project as Art and Arcana. And what I mean by that is simply that for the purposes of scholarship, that's, I think, is important. That is preserved. Who knows how long we would have been able to figure out. I'll give you an example. Some of the earliest art in D&D, right? You look at these original D&D books. Who was Keenan Powell? Who was Cookie Corey? Who was Tracy Lesh? These names that show up that you weren't sure who these people were, and we went and dug into this. Oh, Keenan Powell was Gary's sister-in-law. Oh, Tracy Lesh was this 14-year-old kid that was a classmate of Elisa, who she saw one day drawing in class. He was a pretty good artist, and she told her dad about him, and then Gary started hiring him to do these early illustrations for the original Tomb of Horrors tournament, for Boot Hill, the role-playing game, for all these original, for the Dungeon board game, and so. Again, I think the thing I'm most proud about is we were able to shine a light on some people that really deserved a whole lot of credit that were largely forgotten from D&D history. They were just, not in any of the, and frankly, most people had forgotten kind of who they were or what they had done. That was probably one of the most meaningful things, like to dig this stuff up and figure out who was this person, what did they do, and oh wow, and then they did this later, or just to give them some credit for this important, like, groundbreaking work they did early on. So that was like one of the coolest things, and I'm really glad we were able to put that in a book. And as you say, hopefully, 100 years from now, somebody will look at that and remember, who these people were and what they did.
No, I think that's really important too. Because, anytime there's a narrative around something famous or important, it gets streamlined to the point where a few names are mentioned. But then all these other people who contributed, really valuable parts, they get kind of lost in the shuffle. So, all right. So speaking of how important it is to document history, check this segue out. It's amazing. Since 1988, one of the most prominent figures in D&D history has been Drizzt Do'Urden. How'd you like that segue? Beautiful. Amazing. I've got chills. So, in all seriousness, I don't want people, don't forget about Vivian Van Tassel and The Secret of the Midnight Lake. Sounds super fun. Don't forget about Lore and Legends, the visual history of 5e, or Mike and his friends in books. He does stuff on his own. He also does it team effort sometimes. But for the rest of the show, we're going to be talking about a new book that I happen to have in my hands right now. It's The Legend of Drizzt, Visual Dictionary by Michael Witwer. That's what it says right here on the cover. So this is one of those DK books. If you don't know what I'm talking about, DK puts out these great, like, anytime I'm at like Barnes and Noble or whatever, they'll have one sitting out and I'll just have to stop and browse through it because they've got so much cool stuff in them. They have these, and they cover a lot of different topics. I mean, it might be a movie, or it might be comic books or something else. But this one is Visual Dictionary of the Legend of Drizzt, but it's also kind of by default a somewhat of a visual history of the Forgotten Realms. Because I think the second book written in the Forgotten Realms setting was the Crystal Shard. I might be wrong. Maybe it was the second one published. So if
yes, I believe you've got that one right. And of course it was so yes, to your point, Crystal Shard was published in 1988. Forgotten Realms, of course, started in 1987. That's when the box set comes out. And there was one other novel before, a Forgotten Realms novel specifically before Crystal Shard came out, but Crystal Shard certainly, from a narrative perspective, put the Forgotten Realms on the map in that respect.
Yeah, the first book was Dark Walker on Moonshine, if I remember right. Was that Douglas Niles? I'll have to go look. If that's not Douglas Niles, I apologize to whoever the author.
You know, it's funny. I was blanking out as well, but Doug Niles was the name in my head, right. And I think that is correct. I believe Doug Niles was the first one to write.
So if it's a different author, I apologize. But that was set in kind of a subsection of the Forgotten Realms called the Moonshine Isles, a series of islands. So it was still in the Forgotten Realms, but it wasn't like in the part of the Forgotten Realms that most people think of, which the Forgotten Realms is a huge.
Yeah, setting. The Moonshine Isles are way out west in the Sea of Swords. Way out west of the Sword Coast, which of course is what everybody. That's kind of like ground zero for the Forgotten Realms, right? It's the area that everybody knows. Right. It's where Waterdeep and Neverwinter and Baldur's Gate and all those places are. And that's where
the movie is firmly set, is right in the Sword Coast. So,
absolutely. No, there's a lot of time. But they also spent, again, I give them a lot of credit. They also spent a lot of time in places that were like less known, which I thought was cool too. Really cool.
Yeah, it was. So, get a little bit of trivia here. Let me get my my notes here. So the first novel with Drizzt and the second novel in the Forgotten Realms period. Oh, and I got to go back and say, because there's people out here listening that are be like, I don't know, the Forgotten Realms was before 1987. Yes, Ed Greenwood created the Forgotten Realms way before then, but as Mike clarified, it was published. I think the setting was for the Forgotten Realms was published around 1987. But Ed Greenwood, it had been his personal thing long before then. There's always people out there that be like, no, it wasn't 1987. It's like, well, Mike did say published. So the first novel with Drizzt, and Drizzt is, if you somehow don't know, Drizzt, is a drow / dark elf. Now it's called Uda Drow. But that's a fairly recent thing. They've split the drow up into 3, I think, factions is the wrong word. But now when you refer to the drow that live in the Underdark that serve Lolth and all that, it's Uda Drow. So, but for the purposes of this, I'm just going to say drow for the purposes of this podcast. But if you want to be technically accurate, Drizzt is an Uda Drow, which is known as a dark elf. They live under the ground in the Underdark. Their main city is, and I'm always going to say it wrong, Minzo Baranzan. I've heard it pronounced differently, but that's it.
Yeah, very good. Yeah,
that's how I've always said it. And he came from, at the time, and still for the most part, but at the time when he was first created and written, and in the settings and lore of D&D at the time, the drow were just an evil race. That's all there was to it. Now, there's been nuance and distinction and things woven into the lore since then. But you had a dark elf who decided to leave all that behind and try to live a good life, and spent his time helping people, while at the same time usually being feared and reviled by the people that he ran into on the surface. So that was the Crystal Shard. Was the first book in a trilogy. Came out in 1988. You had Drizzt, who was not the main character. He was a supporting character. You had Wolfgar, who was a young barbarian. You had Bruenor Battlehammer, who was a dwarf, and I think was Cadibri in the first books. I can't remember. It's been so long since I read.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So
absolutely.
So it was an adventuring party. Oh, and you had Regis the Halfling. So
yes.
Yeah. So and they lived in the northern part of the Forgotten Realms in an area called Ten Towns. And if I remember right, please correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. I know you've been way deeper in this lore recently than I have. If I remember right, and Drizzt was created, and these books were written by Robert A. Salvatore. Is it Salvatore or Salvatore?
Salvatore. Is how I've always heard it pronounced, and I believe how he says it.
Yeah, so Salvatore. And if I understand correctly, I feel like I remember at a certain time he expected Wolfgar to be the main character as the series went on, but Drizzt was so ridiculously popular that he soon sort of have you heard the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I've heard Bob Salvatore tell the story, and it's just that as the story goes, this is Bob Salvatore was not a published author at the time. He had done creative writing in college, but he was working as like a financial specialist. And he was sending in submissions to TSR. He was really interested in fantasy. He loved Lord of the Rings, and he had written a previous novel that had kind of made the slush pile at TSR, and somebody had liked what he had written. They were really interested in it. And this is happening right when they had just rolled out the Forgotten Realms. They knew they needed writers to support that. And keep in mind, by the way, as a matter of context, what TSR is thinking about at the time is this. Hey, we just did this multimedia approach with Dragonlance. It went really well. Dragonlance did a great job of melding novels with calendars, with tabletop modules, it was this multimedia approach that they had kind of perfected, or they had piloted with Dragonlance, which had done great. Forgotten Realms was the next experiment with that. They wanted to go bigger on it. They needed a new very detailed realm. They went to Ed Greenwood, who, of course, had been populating the pages of Dragon magazine now for many years, writing about the realms. Greenwood, as you'd mentioned, he came up with the realms for his own, imagining in the late 60s, and he had been kind of thinking about this fantasy world building that he'd been doing. And by the late 70s, he's already contributing to Dragon magazine. He's doing it frequently by the 80s, and then it was at that point that they decided, Jeff Grubb decided to hire him to go ahead and use his campaign world to create this new multimedia approach. So, again, by that time, TSR is sitting there saying, no, when you roll out a big campaign setting like this, you do it with novels and all this other stuff. So Salvatore is trying to get in the door over there. He's sending in submissions. And they like his writing, and I can understand why. He's just a brilliant writer, even from the word go. Again, I'm amazed. If you read The Crystal Shard thinking that's a debut novel, pretty incredible.
No, it's solid.
I'm amazed
it's super
by
solid.
What he was able to do.
Yeah, no, it doesn't read like a first novel.
It doesn't.
His books, they'll just pull you along. They're good, fun adventure books. I mean, they just, they're not boring. They're not tedious. He's a very good adventure fantasy writer, without a doubt.
Yeah, really talented person. And so, so yes, to answer your question, what had happened as the story goes is that they had asked him to write this book like in an unfair period of time, like 3 months, like write us a thing. And so he had written either early chapters or maybe an entire early draft. I don't recall which, but Wolfgar, the barbarian Wolfgar, who's this 7 foot tall, classic D&D barbarian from Icewind Dale, and he was supposed to be the main character. And Drizzt was this, who is this drow kind of sidekick and side character, was in there. And what had ended up happening is that when they were reading these early chapters, these early submissions, the person that was the editor at TSR said, "Hey, I want to hear more about this Drizzt character. Who's this? This character's fascinating." And they changed course, and Drizzt became he kind of earned, you might say, he earned his way to be the main character because he was so darn interesting, and that became the focus of the Crystal Shard. And so Drizzt became the main character. Everybody else, all extremely key characters, by the way. So you've got Drizzt and you've got what they call the companions, right? The companions are all these other key characters. And by the way, some of them have their own books as well, right? Wolfgar the Barbarian is one of them. Cadibri Caddy Bree, by the way, is the first of the companions to meet Drizzt. Actually, as a young girl, she's like 11 years old, 12 years old when he meets Caddy Bree on Icewind Dale. I'm sorry, on the mountain in Icewind Dale, rather,
Right.
Called Kelvin's Cairn. Brunner Battlehammer, the ornery dwarf dwarven king, and then of course Regis the halfling, who's kind of a scoundrel. Again, so you've got this incredible, great cast of characters. But yeah, so Salvatore was asked to change course and make Drizzt the main character, and he wrote this thing like unfairly fast. I don't remember how fast it was. And then again, this book came out. And in a short period of time, it had gotten a really, really great following, and it was a huge success. And it wasn't long after that before he started making New York Times bestseller lists and all that stuff. I don't recall whether the Crystal Shard actually made those lists, but the Crystal Shard was a big success, and it just launched him into, again, his first trilogy, which, of course, is the Icewind Dale trilogy, and then his second trilogy, which is also a tremendously good trilogy, called the Dark Elf trilogy, which is the origin story of Drizzt. So then he actually goes. It's a prequel trilogy. He goes back in time and he tells where Drizzt came from and what his background was and how he got here. So, and then the rest is history. Again, there's been roughly 40 books in the series total now. So he's done a lot of Drizzt books.
Well, my favorite Drizzt book is actually. And I've definitely read more than one, but my favorite, I think it was Homeland, where it told it was all set in Menzo Baranzan in that Dark Elf trilogy, and it told of the power struggles between all the different houses in Menzo Baranzan. And that I still remember crystal clear, because I'd never read a fantasy book like that before then, where it was more about the intrigues of the different houses competing against each other than it was just, storming the dungeon and killing the bad guy or whatever. And that was just fascinating to me.
Well, and it's funny, and if you know this history about it, you can kind of see it at play when you read that book. Again, it's a great book. Homeland's a wonderful book, and Salvatore talks about how when he thought of that, and when he thought about the power struggle and dynamics of Menzo Baranzan, he said it was based on like the New York families, the mob families fighting and vying for power, and that was that way. If memory serves, that was his inspiration for how he came up with how that whole dynamic worked. And you can kind of see it if you read it with that context. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I just remember that one crystal clear. I really enjoyed that. But yeah, so here's a little bit of trivia just to give people an idea, if they don't know, of how popular Drizzt is and the supporting characters and the storylines, the unfolding storylines since 1988. There's been 38 Drizzt books as of August 9th, 2022. The 39th book is coming out in August. That's called Lolth's Warrior. And I'm guessing you may know this with all your recent, research working on this book over the past couple of years. But do you know how many million copies of Drizzt books have been sold?
No, and I hope you know the answer, and you're about to tell me, because I'm as excited as everyone else to hear. Okay,
over 35 million. That's huge. I mean, that's
wow.
Yeah, I mean, so Drizzt is an unqualified success for not only first TSR and then Wizards of the Coast, but for fantasy characters and publishing in general. I mean, that's huge.
Oh, I can't say enough about what Drizzt and what Bob Salvatore has done for the brand. Because again, it was, and by the way, that's not to take anything away from the Dragonlance novels have been hugely successful and wonderful as well. And they're just dynamite in their own ways. But, I have to say, again, this wonderful character and characters, I should say, they're actually all really fun, wonderful, dynamic characters. But Drizzt, I mean, something about this person raised in this terrible the circumstances of Menzo Baranzan, and this culture of demon worshipping elves, that are following Lolth, who of course is the Spider Queen, and she's evil. And he's raised, with all of these challenges and these circumstances, and for him to kind of come out of that and make his own choice, and choose good, listen to his heart, and like it's just it's a classic hero story, And one of my favorite quotes from Bob Salvatore is that Drizzt always does right even when it hurts, and I'm like, yeah, that's what a hero is all about. Is that he does not choose the easy path for him. He chooses a really difficult path. He's just an amazing character, just a wonderful character. And one thing I do love about the books that I think was a really smart choice. Again, this is why I say I'm amazed, even when he was a really early author, about a lot of the choices he made. So all of at least again, many of all of the early books are this way. They're all organized into parts. And so there's like a part 1, part 2, part 3, and so forth, and they all open with a Drizzt journal entry. So it's literally his own voice talking to, you might say, the camera, right? And they're like super deep. Like Drizzt doesn't talk like this in the books. Like they're these super philosophical, deep writings, and I think they're amazing because to me he's really cleverly given you this insight into this person's heart and to their like deepest, most sincere and insecure thoughts. And so you take that with you as you read the rest of these books, that this is the guy that wrote these journal entries, and you know what he's struggling with, you know what he's thinking about. I love that because to me it adds so much complexity to this character that's otherwise this kind of gunslinger that runs around, the Forgotten Realms and the Underdark early on, and he's this amazing, two-sword fighter that's kind of righting wrongs everywhere he goes. But he's got these incredibly deep philosophical thoughts that is kind of behind all of his actions. It's a really rich series. That's something I love about it.
Yeah, it's good stuff. He's a great character. Of course, he does show up in other, like, some video games and things like that. But primarily, Drizzt is a novel character. I wouldn't be surprised with his popularity if he didn't make it onto the big screen someday. But yeah, so there's been 38 books. There's a 39th coming in August, over 35 million sold. And during that time, like I said, the story of Drizzt, I want to take it back to your book here. The Legend of Drizzt Visual Dictionary. This is as much a dictionary on his companions and on locations and personalities and monsters and lore of the Forgotten Realms as it is on Drizzt, because the books have been firmly, in the Forgotten Realms. So there's a lot of great stuff in here. I mean, this is one of those books you just get lost in. I mean, it's you're like, oh, let me look at this. And then you look up an hour later, because you've just been, oh, let me look at this. And you're just flipping pages, and every page has great art, fascinating trivia, cool entries. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that, and even though I think I know a lot of stuff about the Forgotten Realms and whatnot, but I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. And, the companions they get a lot of love here. Their history and what they do and the stuff they carry. It even goes into adventuring classes in general, goes into just all kinds of stuff. So it's got plenty of good, crunchy, amazing stuff in here on Drizzt. But again, I want to press that it's a good reference for D&D and the Forgotten Realms. So I got to ask this, every time I see one of these books, I'm like, I got to know how long does it take to put one of these together? Because it's just dense with information. I mean, there's no filler. It's dense. Every page is just jam-packed with information. So how long does it take to put one of these books together?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Shane. And the answer is, in this particular case, not as long as you think.
Okay.
So what happened with this book? So a couple of things, firstly, by the way, it's very much by intention that this book is every bit as much a source book for the Forgotten Realms as it is for Drizzt and the Companions. That was always by intention. We wanted to cover all of the realms, because what me and the people at DK, in collaboration with Wizards of the Coast, had talked about was that, well, firstly, you said it yourself, 35 million copies of Drizzt sold. It's probably a pretty good bet that more people experience the Forgotten Realms through the eyes of Drizzt than just about anywhere else.
Okay, fair.
Whether it was playing the tabletop role-playing game or right? Like, consider this. Whether you played D&D or not, maybe you played the Forgotten Realms, maybe you didn't, right? Maybe that was one of your campaign settings if in second edition or third edition or whatever. But consider that, like, most people didn't, right? Like most people that played D&D probably actually a percentage of them played FR material, Forgotten Realms material. Most of them probably didn't. So, but you may read a fantasy novel that has to do with D&D or about the Forgotten Realms. You may have read the Drizzt books. So consider, like, the Drizzt books are the greatest tour of the Forgotten Realms that the campaign's ever gotten. And I would say probably more people experience the Forgotten Realms and touch the Forgotten Realms through Drizzt and the Drizzt books than playing the game, probably. So consider, that was obviously a huge part of, like, where he goes and what he does and learning the history of the realms itself. That's a lot of what Drizzt is about. And so when we first conceptualized this book was actually, I'm just going to say it. It was probably the most challenging project of my career, and it's not because again, the publishers and the people at DK are unbelievable. Wizards was hugely supportive as the license partner and gave a lot of feedback, and they were very involved in helping us with research and all kinds of different things. So I can tell you the writing of this book, the actual writing from when I started to end, was about 3 months. It's by far the fastest book I've ever written.
Wow.
And I hope it's the fastest book I ever write because it was hard. I will tell you, it was the hardest period of my life professionally I've ever had. Consider I have a full-time job as well. I have 4 wonderful kids that I try to be a good dad to. It was a legit 50, 60 hours a week of working on this book on top of all of that. Wow. So I've never worked a schedule like this.
That is hardcore.
But again, I'll tell you, I was passionate about it. I was so thrilled to be involved in it. What ended up happening was, this was the first D&D book that DK was going to do. You mentioned it yourself. DK has kind of cornered the market on these, like, super high detailed graphical books that have all these annotations, right? These little call outs that when you look at a picture, they do a little call out that says, oh, that's a pauldron. Oh, that's a magical amulet of this. Oh, that weapon, that's Drizzt's sword. That's called Twinkle. This one's called Icing Death. And so it's all about the details. DK is all about the details. And in particular, they're really known for young adult and children's encyclopedias and things like that, where they like to do, encyclopedias, visual encyclopedias about dinosaurs or any number of, pirates, any number of topics, right? But DK, that is their style. That's what they do, right? So they have this incredible team of designers and editors that just, they know how to do this, and they know how to do it fast. And so I was really pleased to be asked to be part of this project, to write the project. So I got together with DK, and before the writing started, we outlined what needed to be in the book. So I do know the Drizzt series. They did pick me for this because I do know this series really well. And so we outlined the book. We spent, a couple of weeks probably figuring out, well, what's all the stuff we need to do to cover the entirety, as a supplemental book, to cover the entirety of the 40-book or almost 40-book Drizzt series. Okay. So we do that. So in other words, we say, oh, well, there's got to be, of course, a spread or more on each of the companions, obviously. A spread or more on each of the main villains. We mentioned Lolth earlier. Obviously, you have to do a spread or two on Lolth. We have to cover all of the different, drow factions. We have to cover all the locations. We need to do a spread on Neverwinter. We need to do one on Waterdeep. We need to do one on the Underdark, one on Menzoberranzan, one on Luskan, right? So we need to cover all these different areas. So by and large, what happens is it becomes this ad hoc source book for the Forgotten Realms, right? Almost very naturally, because they've covered all this ground in the book series. So we figured out all this stuff that we thought was essential. And again, the book's about 200 pages, right? So we in the book world, you think of that as 100 spreads, right? You've got 100 like one-shot spreads to kind of cover everything you want to cover as a supplemental reader's guide, you might say, to Drizzt, right? And so one of the things we actually did, and I have to tell you, it's actually the single most challenging spread in the whole book, in the respect that it took me the longest. I spent well, I spent a while. I spent probably a whole weekend. Well, it was a while. I'm gonna say it was 30 hours on this spread alone.
Wow.
So one thing we did is something that I felt very passionate about is I didn't like the idea that we were going to do a supplemental book that just visually and graphically and from an education standpoint covered everything, but it was supplemental. In other words, I didn't want anyone that picks up this book, I didn't want it to be required reading that you read all 40 books or that you really, really knew Drizzt or the Forgotten Realms like the back of your hand. In other words, like it wouldn't make sense to open up a spread on Neverwinter. And like, for a reader that doesn't know anything about Neverwinter, they go, okay, well, you can learn it, right? It's kind of standalone. And in fact, it's not kind of, it is standalone. But I didn't want everything to hinge around the idea that you really knew Drizzt really well. So one thing that I was really passionate about is I wanted to do a Drizzt timeline. So one of the first spreads of the book, it's in the first, 4 or 5 spreads, is that we did a full timeline of the Drizzt series. Yeah, it's on, whatever it is. Like this is page 18 and 19, and whatever spread that is in the book.
I'm looking at it
So
right
it's
now.
called The Adventures of Drizzt. Yeah, so it's got like 80 entries or something crazy, right? Again, I felt really passionate about what if someone's never read a Drizzt book? None of this book makes sense about why what's in it is in it if you don't at least give them a chance to read a whole timeline of everything that's important that's happened to Drizzt. So you can imagine trying to summarize all that material. It was agony. But I have to tell you, I'm super proud of this timeline. Again, it's by year. Drizzt has about a 200-year history.
You came up with this timeline. Like, this is your baby.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and again, I wrote all the text in this book, but this timeline, which is funny because it's not as you can see, it's almost all text. So it's probably one of the most uninteresting spreads in the book because it's not graphical, it's not pretty, it doesn't have cool annotations.
It's the only 2 pages in the book that don't have any pictures. All the rest of the book is jammed.
Exactly. And again, I fully expect people that will pick this up, they will glaze over this, and by all means, glaze over it. But what I was proud of is just that distilling this down to a timeline like this was agony. It was just so challenging. Because again, there's like 40 books. There's like an honest, from the Drizzt standpoint, there's probably an honest, 33, 34 books that are specifically about Drizzt. Keep in mind, some of the books in the Drizzt series actually are about like Jarlaxle. And there are some like offshoots, but ultimately, again, like distilling this down to like, here is the story of Drizzt and the companions and trying to sum all that up. And again, the reason I did it, because I really wanted to make sure anyone that picked up this book could at least, if they wanted to dig into this, they could go ahead and read or at least glaze through this timeline and then understand why we've picked the villains that we did. We picked the locations that we did. It was all there. And so what I'm proud of in this book is that I believe that while it's definitely a supplement to the Drizzt books and to the Drizzt legacy and legend, they say, the legend of Drizzt, it's also a standalone book. That is to say, all the information you need to understand everything about Drizzt and the Forgotten Realms is all here. And so that's probably one of the things I'm most proud about, even though it's a small detail in the big picture.
Well, I didn't realize that when I look through something like that and I see a timeline, I'm assuming that Wizards of the Coast gave you that timeline. It doesn't occur to me to think that you're the one that had to go condense all that information down into that. Because I guarantee you, people will be using that timeline as a reference from here on out. So, it's amazing.
Well, no, I hope they do. And by the way, but let me give some props to Wizards of the Coast, though, because they worked with me a lot on that timeline. So just so you know, that could have never happened without the research efforts of some people over there that are their lore masters. They were absolutely hugely instrumental in that thing coming together. So I cannot take credit for figuring out how to distill. They really helped me distill a lot of that as well, just so you know. So, but again, super proud of the effort about how it came out. And to your point, I was just proud that we were able to publish a full Drizzt timeline that you really can't find anywhere else. In addition to, again, this book, you said it yourself, it is so full of details. Again, we try to leave no stone unturned with regard to here's this great illustration of Drizzt or of Brunner, and then there's like a annotation to like, oh yeah, and there's Brunner's axe. It's called Flame Tongue,
Right.
and it's that's actually a magical weapon in D&D. It's called a Flame Tongue actually, and it can like burst into flames, and it does extra fire. Like so, like we give you all of that detail, and we just do it painstakingly. So this book again, it was a hugely challenging book to work on because the details were everything. And the timeline that we were on was so terribly fast that it just took everything that I had to make this thing happen from my perspective. And by the way, I was just one little piece of this much bigger effort between, again, the people at Wizards doing incredible work and the people at DK and my editor, David Fentiman, who's brilliant. And he's able to just pull all this stuff together. He's able to make, order out of chaos. And then he's got this whole art team that's working on a combination of commissioning new illustrations for the book, and then actually working with old illustrations and kind of making new versions of those where they cut out, this sword is depicted in this illustration, but it's not standalone, so we have to cut it out and then put it into a separate illustration and then annotate it. Like, it was just this incredible effort. I cannot believe we did it. The whole book, again, I don't know if it was the whole project schedule was probably more like 6 months. My part of it was probably about 3 months of actually writing text. So again, I am really proud of how it came out. I guess, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I am really proud with the finished result, and I'm just blown away by what DK did.
You're answering questions that I had written down to ask you, like, how did the art get done? And, how did this happen? And because when I see these books, I know that a lot of effort. I'm surprised that it was done in 6 months, because there's a lot of effort went into this. But to give people an idea of the level of detail, there's a picture in here of a knucklehead trout, which is the kind of trout they catch around 10 towns. I think one of the towns, industry is around knucklehead trout, if I remember right. Didn't Regis at the beginning, like he would do art on knucklehead trout, or somebody did, like they would design.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Regis is a scrimshaw artist, and the knucklehead trout have these big skulls that is really desirable for trade once they're designed with scrimshaw. So Regis carves these things up and he decorates them, and that the big export out of Icewind Dale, out of 10 towns, which is this really secluded group of, as it sounds like, 10 towns around these 3 lakes in this desolate tundra of Icewind Dale. So this really treacherous, kind of always winter place. So knucklehead trout, for that reason, is actually like the only meaningful export out of Icewind Dale. So basically, these trade caravans come up from Luskin and other places that are south of the spine of the world, and they come up and they trade for this knucklehead trout scrimshaw. So yeah, that's kind of the background of that.
Yeah, so if you've ever wondered what a knucklehead trout looks like, it's in there, baby. And they also have there's a picture of a mind flayer tadpole. So what I'm saying is there's art depicting stuff from the big to the small. It's not just like the main characters that get art. There's art for everything. So it's literally a visual dictionary. So there's art and descriptions and text and write-ups on like everything. So it's really cool. So I have to ask you, if you had to choose magic item-wise, if you could have Dritzt's twin scimitars, you named, I think, Twinkle and Icing Death, or you could have Bruenner's shield as an unending supply of mugs of ale. Which would you go for?
Oh gosh, it's a good. I mean, it's a good question. It would be hard to not. I mean, do I get both scimitars? Because I mean, like Dritzt's swords are pretty awesome.
Yeah, you get both.
Yeah, no, if I get both scimitars, I think I'm going to have to go with Dritzt's swords. But yes, Brunner does have a shield that we later learn. I don't remember what book it is, but it's quite a bit later where we learn that it has this magical capacity. So the Clan Battlehammer, Brunner Battlehammer is his name, right? He's from Clan Battlehammer. He's the king of Clan Battlehammer, and his personal sigil is a frothing mug, right, with these crossed like hammers on it or whatever, right? And so, yeah, the frothing mug is actually like a magical element of the shield that he has. He can actually create these frothing mugs of an elixir that is reviving.
Yeah, he just pulls them out from behind the shield. Like nobody ever actually sees them appear. He just pulls them out. So if I remember right.
Yeah, and I have to admit, like, I have to admit, I'm trying to remember exactly where that comes up and how, what book or what legend or what even adventure that may come from. But it does come from something. But yeah, it's yeah. Again, there's all these incredible details, and you know, one of the expectation, right, that even for big Drizzt fans is, you know, have they read all the books? And most people know, right? I mean, like even big Drizzt fans, maybe you've read half of them, maybe you've read 3/4, maybe you've read the first 2 or 3 trilogies, right? So consider that all these details, again, I think they're really fun for a lot of people that know the series pretty well, know the Legend of Drizzt pretty well. And then you learn about all these like really quirky details like that, you know, or again, and a lot of this stuff, again, happens quite a bit later in the series too, right? So, you know, for example, you know, Catti-brie is a great example. You know, people that don't know the later stuff, you know, may not know that she becomes this like super powerful wizard later on in her life.
She multi-classes.
She multi-classes, and again, I don't want to give away spoilers, but she's brought back from the dead at one point, and yes, she multi-classes, and she becomes this like super powerful wizard. And to your point, you know, multi-classing, great example of you know, D&D mechanics and lore showing up kind of on screen in this respect in these novels. Drizzt is a multi-class character. People, I don't know if people think of him that way or not. But, you know, when he's in Menzoberranzan, you mentioned Homeland, the first book and that first trilogy, he's effectively a fighter. You know, he trains at Melee Mogtair, which is the Menzoberranzan School of Warriors, basically, right? So he's a double-bladed warrior. It's not until he goes to the surface, which happens in the third book of the prequel trilogy, right? It's not until that book that he learns the ways of the Ranger, which is taught to him by Montolio, right? So he doesn't learn this because everyone thinks of Drizzt as a Ranger. He's actually a fighter originally. He becomes a Ranger when he's taught those skills when he comes to the surface. And then again, here's one that a lot of people don't know if you haven't really followed the series till near the end, because again, this happens way later. He trains as a monk. Way later, and so he takes on another multi-class. I'm going to say this has happened over the last maybe 10 books or so. Maybe it's even the last 4 or 5. It all kind of runs together for me. But yeah, so he has like 2. He's a fighter, he's a ranger, and he's a monk by the current series.
Wow. Yeah. See, I have visited Drizzt more than once in my reading, but I've never gone that deep with it. So this book, flipping through it, I mean, I like Drizzt. I've always liked Drizzt. I've liked, you know, the Forgotten Realms novels and all this, but I was like, man, I want to go dig deeper. I want to read some more of these Drizzt books because there's some really cool stuff going on here. So with that in mind, okay, so you're obviously a deep fan of Drizzt. So without it, because the Crystal Shard was his first book, without it being the Crystal Shard, if you wanted to introduce somebody to Drizzt, like the maximum novel to introduce them, what do you have one that you would recommend? And I know there's only 38 to choose from, so that might be kind of hard. I mean,
you know, so it's funny. Today, you know, it's funny. So the answer to your question is what I would say is that I think you can read those in order at this point. I mean in timeline order. That is to say, you could read the prequel trilogy first, starting with Homeland, right? Because that gives you like the earliest, all the way. You could read them through it in that order. You could, of course, start with the Crystal Shard, which is, of course, is where the actual chronological order happened in our world, right? In real life. So I think you could read those in publishing order. Thank you. Right. Yeah. So I think you could read those either way. But again, actually, I'm going to say something a little bit odd here, which is that you could also, you know, I'm going to say this. I can't actually remember to what extent this would make sense as a standalone. Like whether you could just jump right into them, but because the Neverwinter trilogy has so much stuff that's important right now to like D&D lore, i.e. stuff that's in the movie, the Neverwinter trilogy wouldn't be a bad place to start either, because there's just like a lot of really cool stuff in there with the Red Wizards of Thay and all of that. That's like pretty cool, and they're really action packed, and there's all kinds of cool things that are going on with Neverwinter and Gauntlgrim, and like there's just a lot of cool stuff in there. So I guess off the top of my head, I would probably start with either Crystal Shard or Homeland. But otherwise, if you were to jump somewhere in the middle of the series and wanted to just read like something that's kind of right in the middle, wherever that is. Again, I couldn't tell you whether that's, I don't remember if that's the 4th trilogy or the 6th trilogy or whatever. It's in there somewhere. But the Neverwinter trilogy is pretty awesome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think the last Drizzt book I read, it's been a few years. It was Archmage. Mm-hmm.
That's a great trilogy as well.
Yeah, they were tying in Out of the Abyss with the adventure with the books, and Archmage told the story of how the demon lords got unleashed into the Underdark, which then tells the story of Out of the Abyss. So that was really interesting. And it was one of Drizzt's relatives messed up.
Yep. Well, and the fact that he ends up fighting Demogorgon, right, is pretty awesome. Yeah. And again, the fact that ties in so neatly, and of course that was done by design, of course, right? Like they've actually really aligned the novels are happening at the same time as the adventure themes. And so, yeah, pretty cool. If you're playing Out of the Abyss and you're reading that at the same time, you're like, oh my gosh, this is what's happening on the other side of, the Underdark right now. And so pretty cool, really cool stuff.
Really neat stuff. All right. Well, we've gone for quite a while. I need to let you get back to your regularly scheduled life. I appreciate your time so much, Mike. I always appreciate talking to you. You're such a fun, positive guy doing cool stuff. You're getting to play around with stuff that a lot of D&D and just even Drizzt fans or whatever would love to be involved with. So good for you. I love the fact that you highlighted how strenuous this project was, because it's one thing I always like to point out. The creative life has benefits, but it can be a lot of work. I don't ever want somebody to think that, writing a book or making a comic book or making a movie. Like you said, I've talked to a few people now that are in movie making, and it's amazing to me that any movies ever get made.
Yeah.
That's really hard to do. So, all this creative stuff, there's a real effort behind.
Yeah, no, I feel so grateful to be able to work on this stuff. I mean, honestly, I get to work with extraordinary people. I get to work on intellectual properties that I just am super passionate about. In fact, I couldn't do any of this stuff. I wasn't so interested and passionate about this stuff. I would never find the energy for it. But honestly, I just feel so grateful that I get to do a lot of the work that I do. And again, I don't take any of it for granted. Again, I just love doing this work, and I hope to do a lot more.
And I look forward to it. Another thing I wanted to mention about the book, I was flipping through. There's a few spreads in the book just about monsters. And I just wanted to say that artwork for the rust monster is one of the best pieces of art for a rust. I mean, that's a beautiful piece for that rust monster. And that just shows you the level of art, because most people might think of like rust monsters as like boring or whatever. It's always been one of my favorite monsters, but there's a page that has like oozes and mimics. There's some very cool depictions in the same spread of different shapes that mimics can take, because most people think of them as treasure chests, but they can mimic anything, not just treasure chests. So I just wanted to point that out also to give a little extra kudos to the visual.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, there was some really, really, they did a tremendous job. And again, I have to give so much credit to that team at DK and at Wizards of the Coast. They worked hand in hand to they did the hard work. Again, as amazing as that sounds, again, the writing was challenging because of the timeline on it to try to do all the work we were trying to do. But the people that put together these spreads, the artists, and by the way, let me give one more shout out, by the way. There's a number of new illustrations in this book, and one of the people they hired was Jason Rainville, who's just a brilliant artist that works a lot on 5th edition. He also works on a lot of Magic the Gathering cards and so forth. That's actually what he's probably most known for. But Jason Rainville, he's the one that did the cover. For example, he's the cover artist for Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. Like, he's done a bunch of 5th edition covers. And he did a bunch of new spreads and images for this book that are awesome. And so Again, I can't say enough about really the artists and the designers that worked on this book. They did such an incredible job.
Well, I do recommend, and I'm not being paid to shill or anything like that, people. I'm saying this genuinely. I do recommend anybody who's into Drizzt, D&D, Forgotten Realms, fantasy art or whatever, I'd pick this book up. If you've seen the other DK books, you know what I'm talking about. I'll take that and make it D&D, and it's really super cool stuff. All right, so we've got Legend of Drizzt, Visual Dictionary. Got that. Coming out in October, we've got Lore and Legends, a visual celebration, the 5th edition of the world's greatest role-playing game. And in August, we have Vivian Van Tassel and the Secret of Midnight Lake. But you can get the Legend of Drizzt Visual Dictionary right now. And if you play a game in the Forgotten Realms, get this book and put it on your table while you're playing. I mean, there's a lot of good reference stuff in here. All right, I got to do this to you, Mike. You probably remember I do the bad joke of the week. So even though I don't do the podcast weekly, I still call it the bad joke of the week because it's got a nice ring to it. So here we go. Did you know, Mike, that the leading cause of death in the Underdark is drowning?
Yeah. That's a bad joke of the week. That's a D&D dad joke if I ever heard one.
Yes, sir, it is. Yes, sir, it is. Drowning. Or I guess now it's Uda drowning. Okay. Mike, I appreciate you. You're always welcome back. Look forward to having you back again. You're doing some cool stuff out there. Good luck with all your projects. I know you had said you had some other projects you can't even talk about.
Yeah, one more coming up in November, but not announced yet. So it'll be coming soon.
That is the, let's see what that is. I'm trying to think of a really absurd character that you could do a visual dictionary for. Like you did a visual dictionary on one of the unnamed orcs from the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon. Timeline and everything.
Are you saying that's my upcoming book?
Yeah, that's the upcoming book. Yeah, an unnamed background orc that was in one scene from the old Dungeons & Dragons cartoon. You've done an entire visual dictionary with reference, timeline, and everything. All right, Mike, again, thanks so much. So glad to have you. You're always welcome back on the show.
Thank you.
And everybody else, we will catch you next time on Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.